Welcome back, everyone. And we are going to be talking about topic 7.6 today, which is trade in the world economy. We're going to go ahead and get started with our first EK, PSO 7A1, which is going to be focused on the basics of trade. So before we get to that, we want to get a little bit of history. Over time, people have tried to figure out why countries trade with one another and have come up with different theories to explain that behavior. Back in the 1500s, the 16th century, mercantilism was the primary explanation, which said that each country tried to export more than it imported in order to gain wealth. And this was used to justify colonialism in order to control markets and raw materials, which is very similar to what we see in the Industrial Revolution as well. And then this went hand in hand with something called protectionism, in which trade rules restrict imports in order to protect domestic industries. It's another trade theory that was used alongside mercantilism and has reemerged periodically in more modern times, especially in times of economic hardship, when countries want to protect their own domestic industries. This then led in the 1700s to one of our earliest economists in the Western world, Adam Smith, who introduced an idea of absolute advantage, which said that trade was based on a country's ability to produce a good or service more efficiently than any other country. And this was also something that Adam Smith believed would go along with what's called free trade, and that would direct trade, that people would want to trade because they could create something better than everyone else could. Now, nowadays, we start to see different theories being put forward. And so comparative advantage was introduced in the 20th century as a rejection of absolute advantage. Basically, comparative advantage says that that absolute advantage was inherently unequal to the point where it would make it unlikely for countries to actually trade with one another, because if they didn't have an advantage in something, then there was no benefit for them. So comparative advantage says that a country's ability to produce one product more efficiently than it can produce other products in its economy leads to trade of the surplus of the product that they can do really well with countries that produce things that they want that they can't produce themselves. And that countries would then end up specializing in things in which they have a comparative advantage, and then trading for the stuff that they don't have a comparative advantage in. This also led to this concept of complementarity. That's hard to say fast. And this is a more modern trade theory that measures how well one country's export profile matches with another country's import profile. In other words, do you export what they need, what they import? And so then that leads to this idea of complementing one another, and that a high degree of complementarity would lead to countries becoming successful trade partners, because country A has stuff that country B wants, and country B has stuff that country A wants. And so then that would, if there's like that direct complementarity, it would lead to really beneficial trade programs for both of them. But essentially, the idea is that you trade what you can trade with someone else who needs what you have. And you kind of, and they have what you need. Now, there are some other considerations when we're talking about the basics of trade. More recently, economists are also looking at the role of what are called transnational corporations, or TNCs. And these are firms that have the power to coordinate and control operations in more than one country, even if it doesn't own those operations. And TNCs have become really, really, really important in global trade. And competitive advantage, which would be a firm's relative ability to outperform other transnationals in its industry, drive global trade, or at least that's what modern economists are looking at. And today's global trade patterns see those TNCs trading with one another more than trade happens between countries. It's actually up to 2/3 of global exports are happening between TNCs, not between countries. And the other thing to keep in mind too is that global trade is uneven geographically. About 10 countries, which you can see here, are the world's top exporters of goods and services, and they control more than 50% of world trade. China is the leader in trade goods, and the United States is actually the leader in what are called commercial services. Developing countries are really behind in terms of the rates of trade, so they don't really have as much impact as those like kind of top 10, 15, maybe 20 countries. All right, that's it for the first part. That'll take us to our second EK, so I'll be back with you shortly to pick up on the second part of 7.6.